The day started innocently enough. I was heading to my friend's house for the first time, the usual mix of excitement and nervousness bubbling under my skin. I had imagined meeting him, hanging out in his room, laughing about the usual teenage dramas, but I hadn't anticipated the subtle, unexpected shift that would mark the moment the door swung open. She was standing there, framed by the soft sunlight spilling through the doorway, her presence calm, yet commanding. She looked effortlessly composed, the kind of woman whose elegance didn't shout, but quietly drew your attention. I noticed the faint floral hint in her perfume, a soft, warm scent that clung just long enough to make the air around her feel intimate, though I reminded myself she was my friend's mom. Her smile, though, that was the first thing that really caught me off guard. Warm, knowing, and just slightly teasing, it felt like she could see through the nervous shuffle of my thoughts. "Hi, you must be," she said, her voice smooth and welcoming. Her eyes lingered just a moment longer than necessary, and I felt a flutter in my chest, a curious mixture of admiration, guilt, and something I didn't have a name for yet. As we shook hands, I noticed the light pressure of her touch. It lingered for just an extra second, enough to make my skin tingle. There was nothing overt, nothing inappropriate, yet every detail, the softness of her hand, the warmth of her palm, made my awareness shift, my thoughts scatter. She leaned just slightly forward, her head tilting in that way that made a glance feel intimate. And then came her gentle tease. "You're blushing already? How sweet." I froze, caught somewhere between embarrassment and fascination. My cheeks warmed instantly, and I tried to look casual, to laugh it off, but the way her smile deepened told me she noticed every micro-reaction. It wasn't mockery. It was playful, affectionate, human. There was a softness in her eyes, a subtle recognition of something in me she hadn't expected but didn't mind. I forced a smile, fumbling over a reply, but she simply chuckled and stepped aside, motioning me in. The living room smelled faintly of coffee and home-baked cookies, ordinary and comforting, but I couldn't shake the extraordinary focus I found myself giving her. The way she moved through the space was graceful, almost hypnotic. The slight sway of her hair as she turned, the way her fingers lingered over the edge of a cushion as she adjusted it. Every small gesture seemed magnified, intimate in a way that made my pulse quicken. Even now, as I settled onto the sofa, I couldn't stop noticing her presence. She had a quiet confidence, a warmth that made me both comfortable and acutely aware of myself. Her casual words, her playful teasing, the smallest physical cues, they weren't overt, but they carved a place in my mind, setting the stage for an unspoken connection that was already beginning to take root. That fleeting, almost accidental moment, her noticing my blush, her acknowledging it, was the spark. The slow-burning curiosity had begun, subtle, electric, and undeniably real. And I knew, even as I tried to focus on my friend, that this first encounter would linger in my thoughts far longer than it should, and that every ordinary visit from here on out might feel anything but ordinary. The first encounter lingered in my mind long after I left the doorway behind. Even as I settled into the familiar rhythms of my friend's home, I couldn't shake the awareness of her, the soft tilt of her head when she smiled, the gentle warmth of her presence. What should have been an ordinary visit felt charged, each movement and glance carrying a weight I hadn't anticipated. It started with small, seemingly mundane interactions. She brought me a cup of tea while I sat on the couch, fumbling slightly with the mug, as if unsure where to set it. Our hands brushed, just the tips of our fingers, and for a heartbeat, I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a curious electricity that made my stomach tighten. I caught myself staring longer than polite at the way she moved, the quiet grace in her gestures, and I chastised myself for noticing things I shouldn't. Yet every little detail, the faint scent of her perfume, the soft rustle of her blouse as she leaned over, pulled my attention inescapably. She spoke casually, asking about school, my plans, my life, but there was a subtle playfulness behind her questions, a light teasing in the way she observed me. "So, Still tripping over your own words when you're nervous? She said, a smile tugging at her lips. I felt my face heat again and had to remind myself to breathe, to seem composed, though internally my thoughts raced. Every glance she threw my way seemed charged with something unspoken. When she laughed at a joke, I noticed the slight crinkle at the corner of her eyes, the effortless ease in her voice, and I realized I could spend hours just observing her. Even as she chatted with my friend, I found my eyes drifting back to her. The subtle arch of her brow, the curve of her smile, the way she leaned in slightly when listening. I felt an awareness of her that went beyond admiration. It was a quiet fascination, tinged with something deeper, though I couldn't quite name it yet. I also started noticing her small gestures toward me, tucking a stray hair behind her ear as she spoke to me, letting her hand linger near mine on the table, the casual but deliberate way she arranged the teacups so I could reach them easily. None of it was overt, none of it suggested anything untoward, but it was intimate in its own way. It was the kind of closeness that made my chest tighten with anticipation, even in ordinary moments. By the end of the visit, I realized I was acutely aware of every small movement, every expression, every nuance of her presence. I was fascinated not just by her beauty, but by the warmth, confidence, and subtle vulnerability she carried, and by how easily she made a room feel both comforting and electrifying at the same time. As I left that day, I felt a strange mixture of admiration, nervous excitement, and quiet longing. I knew this wasn't just a casual curiosity. It was the beginning of something delicate, slow, and impossible to ignore. Every glance, every touch, every gentle tease had begun to draw me into a subtle orbit around her, one I didn't want to escape from. As days turned into occasional visits, what had begun as curiosity settled into a quiet awareness. Each time I entered the house, I became more attuned to the nuances of her presence, the way she moved through the space, how her voice carried across the living room, and the small, almost accidental touches that made my pulse flutter. It was an ordinary afternoon, my friend distracted with homework, when she suggested I help in the kitchen. I agreed, trying to focus on chopping vegetables, washing dishes, anything to distract myself from the sudden intimacy of proximity. And yet, even in the mundane, moments of connection found their way. Our hands brushed as we both reached for the same cutting board, a fleeting touch that lingered slightly longer than necessary. My fingers tingled from the brief contact, and I caught myself staring at her hands. The graceful, confident way she moved, the soft skin, the delicate ring she wore. She looked at me, her eyes holding a spark of amusement, a silent acknowledgement of the tension we both seemed to feel. Her laugh, light and unrestrained, filled the kitchen when I dropped a tomato, and she teased me gently. "Careful, you'll ruin dinner before it even starts," she said, her smile warm and playful. The sound wrapped around me like a soft blanket, comforting and intoxicating all at once. I felt caught between wanting to focus and wanting to linger, to just exist in the same space with her. There were other subtle gestures that made my awareness sharper. She would brush a speck of flour off my sleeve, her fingers grazing my arm for a second longer than required. She leaned slightly closer when she asked a question, and I could feel the warmth radiating from her. Nothing overt, nothing inappropriate, but each small touch, each deliberate closeness created a tension I couldn't ignore. My thoughts raced, yet I remained careful, aware of boundaries and the social context, even as my heart thumped faster with every interaction. The kitchen, ordinarily mundane, became a space charged with quiet electricity. The scent of fresh herbs, the warm sunlight spilling through the window, the rhythmic sound of chopping and sizzling. It all seemed to magnify her presence. Each glance between us, every shared smile, carried a weight that I didn't fully understand yet, but didn't want to resist. By the time dinner was ready, I was acutely aware of the subtle intimacy that had built during those shared moments. She had a way of moving through the room that made me notice her constantly, without saying a word. A brush of her hand against mine, a a knowing glance across the counter, a soft laugh at my awkwardness. It all spoke of something unspoken, a connection slowly growing under the surface. That day, I left the kitchen not only with the smell of home-cooked food lingering in my clothes, but also with a new awareness of how her presence affected me. The ordinary act of helping in the kitchen had become something charged with quiet longing and tentative desire, a reminder that in her company, even the simplest shared spaces could feel intimate, electric, and profoundly stirring. As our interactions continued, what had begun as fascination and subtle tension began to shift into something deeper. The playful glances and lingering touches had opened a door, and now I found myself noticing the unspoken sides of her. Moments when her confidence softened into vulnerability and the warmth of her presence became something profoundly comforting. It happened one quiet afternoon. My friend had gone out for a sports practice, leaving the house unusually still. I lingered in the living room, half listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. She emerged from the kitchen, a cup of tea in hand, and sat beside me on the couch. There was a pause, just long enough for the silence to feel charged, and then she spoke, almost offhandedly, about a worry she'd been carrying. I listened, leaning slightly forward, genuinely engaged. Her voice, usually so assured and composed, carried a softness I hadn't noticed before. She spoke of small frustrations, fleeting doubts, the quiet weight of responsibilities that rarely got mentioned. As she shared, her hands traced absent patterns over the teacup, a nervous habit that seemed out of place with her usual grace. I felt a surge of empathy, a protective instinct mingled with admiration. Our proximity was subtle but deliberate. She let her shoulder brush against mine, the warmth radiating subtly through the fabric of our clothes. When she paused, uncertain, I reached out lightly, not with intention beyond comfort, and rested my hand near hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed the gesture, a quiet trust forming in the shared space between us. My pulse quickened, not from desire alone, but from the intimacy of being let in, of witnessing a side of her that few people ever saw. There was a rhythm to the moment. Her words, soft and honest, my attentive silence, the gentle brush of hands, the weight of unspoken understanding. Every glance, every breath seemed amplified. I noticed the subtle tremor in her fingers, the slight tightening of her jaw when she paused, the way her eyes shimmered in the sunlight filtering through the window. Each detail deepened my awareness, making the connection feel intimate, significant, and tender. Even in these quiet moments, the tension was there, not in an overtly romantic or sexual way, but as a slow, simmering energy between us. The comfort she allowed me to provide, the vulnerability she shared, made my attention sharpen, my emotions more intense. I realized I was no longer just aware of her physical presence, but emotionally entwined with it, invested in the small flickers of feeling that passed between us. By the time the conversation drifted to lighter topics, I felt a subtle, profound shift. The bond between us had strengthened, rooted not in grand gestures, but in trust, attention, and quiet understanding. It was a moment that lingered long after it ended, the kind of moment that left a subtle ache in the chest, a tender awareness that something meaningful was growing slowly, deliberately, and beautifully. And as I left that day, the memory of her vulnerability stayed with me, mixing with my admiration and quiet longing, a reminder that connection could be more powerful than attraction alone. It was a step deeper into something I didn't fully understand yet, but already cherished more than I could admit. The days had begun to feel charged with a quiet electricity whenever I visited. By now, my awareness of her presence had evolved from curiosity to something more profound, a gentle, simmering tension that I struggled to ignore. It wasn't about rushing anything or breaking boundaries. It was about noticing the small moments that suddenly seemed to matter more than they should. It was a late afternoon, the kind where sunlight slanted lazily through the living room windows, casting soft golden patterns across the floor. My friend had stepped out, leaving me alone with her as she tidied up after a casual tea. I felt the hum of anticipation in my chest, my senses acutely tuned to her every movement. She handed me a small plate of cookies, her fingers brushing mine for just a moment longer than necessary. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver down my spine. She noticed the effect immediately, her eyes twinkling with a playful warmth, a hint of mischief, and smiled knowingly. Still blushing, she teased softly, her voice carrying that perfect blend of amusement and affection. I nodded, embarrassed, my thoughts scrambling to stay composed. As she moved around the room, I found myself watching the way her hair caught the sunlight, the soft sway of her shoulders, the fluidity in her gestures. Every glance she cast in my direction felt weighted, lingering just long enough to make my pulse quicken. When she reached for something on the counter, our elbows brushed lightly, and I felt a jolt of awareness ripple through me. Her proximity, her warmth, and the gentle intentionality in her movements made ordinary touches feel electric. The tension wasn't just physical, it was in the pauses, the subtle silences where words were unnecessary. We found ourselves in moments where we could have spoken, but didn't because the unspoken connection was already saying more than words ever could. A shared glance across the room, a small tilt of her head, the softness in her smile. Each gesture carried layers of emotion, curiosity, desire, care, and restraint all at once. At one point, she sat down beside me on the couch to fold a blanket, close enough that our knees nearly touched. The warmth of her presence was enveloping, almost dizzying. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the comforting aroma of the room, and the sound of her soft breathing created a rhythm I wanted to memorize. My hands twitched slightly, craving the closeness, but I restrained myself, aware of the delicate balance we were maintaining. By the end of that afternoon, I felt the tension like a living thing between us, invisible but undeniable. Each accidental brush, each teasing glance had built a quiet, simmering anticipation that neither of us acted upon directly, yet both of us felt deeply. It was intoxicating, the kind of slow-burn tension that promised something more without needing to rush, a magnetic pull that made every visit linger in my mind long after I left. And as I walked home that evening, I realized I was both exhilarated and unsettled, caught between admiration, longing, and the bittersweet restraint that made her presence feel more profound, more precious than anything else I'd experienced. By this point, the connection between us had shifted into something that words alone could not capture. We had moved past playful teasing and subtle touches. Now, the intimacy was in the gestures, the pauses, and the silences we shared. Neither of us needed to speak our feelings aloud. The small actions, deliberate and tender, communicated volumes. It began one evening when my friend was out with classmates, leaving the house unusually quiet. I found myself in the living room, a book in hand, while she was on the couch nearby, flipping through an old photo album. I tried to focus on my reading, but her presence made concentration impossible. She shifted slightly, her knee brushing mine as she adjusted herself, and I felt a jolt, a mix of excitement and restraint. The warmth of her body, so close, the faint scent of her perfume, the soft rustle of her clothing. All of it heightened my awareness, my pulse. She caught my glance and didn't look away. Instead, she offered a small, almost shy smile, as though acknowledging the unspoken tension without breaking it. Later, when she noticed me shivering slightly from a draft, she reached for a light shawl and draped it over my shoulders. Her hands lingered on my arms for a moment, warm and reassuring, and I felt the quiet intimacy in that gesture, her way of saying she cared without a word. My heart thumped, but it wasn't nervousness. It was recognition of a shared, unspoken connection. As we sat there, side by side, the room enveloped us in a soft, golden glow from the lamp. Every glance between us carried weight. When she laughed at a comment I made, her hand brushed against mine on the couch, and I didn't pull away. Instead, I allowed the brief contact to linger, savoring the warmth and reassurance it brought. It wasn't romance in the overt sense. It was acknowledgement, trust, and the quiet thrill of being close to someone who understood you in ways few others could. There were other moments of confession through actions. She would rest her hand near mine when handing me something, leaning slightly closer than necessary. She'd tilt her head in my direction while speaking, creating small pockets of closeness. And when I handed her a mug of tea, our fingers brushed again, lingering in that delicate magnetic pause. Each gesture was deliberate yet subtle, a slow unwrapping of our feelings that respected boundaries but never hid the emotional pull between us. By the end of that evening, it was clear neither of us needed to say, "I feel something for you." Our actions had already spoken. The comfort, trust, and growing affection were undeniable. The quiet confessions through touch, proximity, and attentiveness had built a bridge between us, a connection that was both tender and electric. As I left that night, the memory of her gestures stayed with me, lingering in my chest and mind. It was the kind of intimacy that didn't need words, that resonated in a quiet, enduring way. I realized then that this slow-burning connection had deepened into something profoundly meaningful, a bond that was as emotional as it was tender, and one that neither of us wanted to rush. By the time the story reached its quiet conclusion, the tension that had simmered between us for weeks had transformed into something soft, steady, and undeniably comforting. Each glance, each brush of hands, each small gesture of trust and affection had built toward a moment of mutual understanding, a subtle acknowledgement of what had grown between us without the need for dramatic declarations. It was a late afternoon, the golden light spilling gently through the living room windows, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of birds outside. My friend had stepped out, leaving the space intimate and unhurried. She and I found ourselves sitting together on the couch, a blanket draped loosely over our laps, our knees almost touching. The air was heavy with unspoken words, yet light with comfort, a paradox I cherished. She looked at me, her gaze soft but steady, and smiled, a smile that had always carried warmth but now seemed layered with something deeper. I felt my chest tighten, a quiet ache of longing mixed with gratitude. I noticed the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders, the way her hair caught the light, and the subtle warmth radiating from her side as she shifted closer. It wasn't about romance in a conventional sense. It was the feeling of being seen, understood, and quietly cherished. She reached out, her fingers brushing mine as she adjusted the blanket around us. The contact was brief but deliberate, a reaffirmation of the connection we had nurtured through small gestures and subtle touches. I didn't pull away. Instead, I allowed myself to linger in the warmth, in the unspoken acknowledgement that we had shared something special. It was a confession without words, a promise embedded in proximity and gentle attentiveness. Then came the parting moment, tender and unhurried. She stood and gave me a hug, her arms resting lightly around my shoulders, her cheek brushing against mine. I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat, a rhythm that mirrored my own, and I realized that this was the culmination of our slow-burning connection, a physical yet profoundly emotional gesture, completely safe yet infinitely intimate. When we pulled apart, she smiled again, her eyes shining with warmth and quiet pride. "You're growing up faster than I realized," she said softly, teasing yet affectionate. I smiled back, cheeks tinged with the familiar warmth, my heart full with the depth of what had passed between us. As I left the house that evening, I walked slowly, savoring the lingering warmth of her presence. The connection wasn't fleeting. It was a gentle, enduring bond, a mix of admiration, care, and quiet affection that had grown slowly but steadily. I knew our relationship had shifted into something rare, a connection built on trust, subtle desire, and genuine emotional intimacy, all framed in the delicate, respectful boundaries of age and circumstance. It was a warm, fulfilling ending, a slow-burn romance that had reached its quiet peak, leaving us both with a sense of closeness and emotional satisfaction. No dramatic declarations, no rushed confessions, just the steady, comforting truth of shared moments, tender gestures, and mutual understanding. And as I look back one last time at her warm, inviting smile, I knew this was a connection I would carry with me, quietly, profoundly, for a long time to come.